it's getting to be a long day, and so why don't we just take a few questions if people have questions, and then sort of let us all get into the wet weather. If anybody has to leave, or wants to leave, you can.
And you might want to address your question to a particular person or generally, and we swear we're going to keep our answers brief so that you get a lot of questions out there. Yeah, thank you, Bob. Go ahead, please.
This is a question for Dr. Schiff, because you mentioned setting up a frame at the beginning of a session. Could you describe a little bit about that, or give an example?
Well, by a frame, what's usually meant is that you kind of set up a kind of an expectation about what's going on, and what it's going to look like, and what therapy is, and that's a pretty kind of typical thing that's done. So here is what to expect, here's what we'll be working on, here is how we're going to proceed, this is what I'm doing, that's kind of setting the frame therapy, and that will change a little bit over time. But there's something in that, and it's not something that's necessarily imposed, it's also something that's a little bit collaborative in terms of how we're going to work together. And the usual understanding is that if there's a better frame that's set up, that's helpful for them. And when people don't really know what the hell is going on, at times that's a little...
Yeah, to ease the whole situation between both of you.
For Dr.
Weitzner.
Freudian. And it's kind of detailed, but asked in the spirit of on the flyer. He said all the things you wanted to ask, but never did.
What's the question?
In terms of the oral, phallic, genital, and anal, what, if you know, do you know what specific observations, I mean actual specific things that Freud saw that he made those connections?
Well, Freud didn't work directly with children, and he made some observations of his own children and other people's children, but so that may have influenced him. What he saw was the fact that there's a strong sucking in state in newborns, and he knew from developmental histories that around between the ages of 1.5 and 2, there's a very strong preoccupation with the bowel function, and he knew about the Oedipus complex. So he theorized, based mostly on the analysis of adult neurotics, that they could be fixated at these different phases, and that the oral, that the libido itself was contributed to from various streams, from different erotogenic zones, beginning with the mouth and then the anus, and then at the same time the musculature became a kind of auxiliary erotogenic zone because of the impulse to move and to be aggressive, and then the genitals. So it was based on reconstruction from adult analyses.
Just like earlier when you talked about the stingy or whatever, he just saw that enough times that he somehow said that's connected
He had a certain number of patients, he doesn't have a series of cases, he doesn't say how many, and he knew from their histories that they all had difficulty toilet training. But when their parents told them to go to the potty, they would refuse. And he concluded that they were fixated on the anal pleasure of defecating, and that pleasure is increased when you hold it in and then suddenly let it out. And then he inferred from their character traits that these were prolongations of anal pleasures or anal frustrations.
Is there a specific essay or book where he summarizes all
Well,
this?
there's this famous paper from, I think, 1908 called The Anal Character.
No, but I mean it covers all the stages.
Oh, the 3 essays on theory of sexuality, which Reich talks about in the function of the orgasm as the basis, for libido theory.
I remember reading that, but he didn't give the kind of details that I was hoping for. Maybe they're in his archives somewhere. All right, thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah.
For anyone? Go ahead, please.
I will address it to you, but I'm also curious for the whole panel. I was curious, when you were describing that session, was it the first session that you did bio-emotional work or biophysical work?
Mm-hmm.
And you immediately went to fear when you saw that in the person?
She said she was afraid.
Yeah. Because I'm curious about whether you see different phases of therapy as being the times when people can deal with different emotions more readily. I mean, my training, fear was an emotion that we were counseled came much later in term. And it's probably, and it's been my clinical experience as well, that it's one of the feelings that people have the most difficulty getting through, and it really requires a tremendous amount of trust in the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what was interesting is that in the course of that session, it wasn't really much that came out in terms of fear, but what came out more was in terms of her crying and then how she couldn't make a sound and so on and so forth. So it wasn't like that in itself triggered a lot of fear. But she introduced that. But I understand what you're saying, because fear does bring up a great deal of person. It's kind of I think there are these kind of things to kind of keep in mind, and also to follow the individual process and kind of call.
And I just was curious in terms of what Wendy was talking about earlier, but my first association when you were talking about this woman was that she was from a Jewish Orthodox background. Is that true? Okay, because I think these things are really crucial, and I have strong feelings that we need to deal with people in their social and cultural contexts. And
No, I would agree.
okay.
Of course, it's purely accidental that all of us are Jewish men of a certain age.
Purely.
Any other questions or comments, please? Nathan and then Trevor.
Quick little comment, just, someone much more familiar with Reich than with Freud, but knowing of the reverence for Freud that Reich had, etc., it's kind of mind-blowing to hear a comment like Freud sat behind the patient because he didn't like to face the patient. I mean, anybody want to isn't that a little, bizarre for somebody who's a pioneer in human interaction?
Well, the point is that's the point, is that everything gets blown out of proportion when you become an icon, an iconographic figure. Freud, by all accounts, was relatively, he wasn't the Freud you see in the pictures of the formal pictures. He was fairly vocal, very clear about who he was, and he specifically developed that technique because he was clear that this is how he felt most comfortable, and so I think it's shocking to us because it's when you learn that the technique really emerged out of Freud's own behavior and structure rather than what most of us inherit when we first come in contact with psychoanalysis, that this is the way psychoanalysis is done. Freud, in fact, for instance, was not remote from his patients in most cases. They came into his house, he often shared food with them, and he was very, he would tell them what was going on with his family, things that, he was very much,
It doesn't strike you as incongruous that the same person who is doing
well,
this therapy...
it should be understood, and maybe it's not made clear enough, that he wasn't always in that position. That actually, in the earlier stages of his initial points of treatment, right, he tended to be much more aggressive. He actually worked when he used hypnotism at various times.
Right. Okay.
And at other times, he actually, which I always found very fascinating, there was a period of time when he actually manipulated and used pressure and physical contact on the cranium.
Correct.
And so it wasn't as if, and that often he was in face-to-face contact with patients when they would come in and talk.
There was more than one Freud in different...
Right. So
Yeah, I don't think it's really that hard to understand because he was trying to give not his patient the maximum freedom, free association.
Right, exactly.
Right. Okay, so it wasn't so much a personal discomfort.
He was afraid that his reaction would distract the patient from free association.
In other words, he had a rationale for it. The issue is in the private letters, we find out that he also found sitting and listening and work, that actually the development of the free associative technique and the final style was actually something he didn't really like that much. He developed it, it wasn't suited to him, he found it, he would comment how hard it was for him to sit continuously listening to in that way, and so it interfaced. So it wasn't like, oh, I can't stand this, I want to go to sleep, I got to sit behind the patient. You know.
Trevor, you had a question.
Yeah, I was hoping that something more could be said about door and the death instinct. Like because I heard talk about stagnation of energy, but how does it manifest itself? I mean,
Well, I think that's a very, I think it's other people's comments, it's a very big question, and in order to really answer, first we'd have to discuss the nature of orgone energy, then we'd have to discuss, the things that, generate and produce deadly orgone energy, and how it manifests itself in various situations, particularly in the human organism.
And also in the atmosphere.
In the atmosphere. So it's probably well beyond a discussion here, needless to say, that in humans, it manifests itself largely in the most common manifestation, Dr. Sobel always pointed out to me, and I see this certainly in practice, is sweating and body odor, which is distinctive in some patients in particular sessions have just taken a shower and perfectly fine fiddle, and they lie down on the couch, and when there's a real release, the bed is, well, I work in traditional I'm more or less an orthodox orgonomist in that sense. So the patient, the sheet, we have a plastic sheet under the bed, is soaked and has a distinctively strong, odor to it, and it's, even the patient will come, I don't know what that's from, and what it's from is the release in the body. So these are characteristics, but to talk, it would be a fascinating subject for a seminar, but probably beyond most popular interest.
But there's something I want to say. Oh, if you get all the selected writings, the last section on the Orinor, it talks about door and door busting, et cetera, et cetera. But what Dr. Lewis said earlier about the death instinct was at the very end of Reich's life, in 1956, he published an article in Orgonomic Medicine, which was sort of the last hurrah, in which he suggested that when Freud developed the concept of the death instinct, he intuited this notion of life energy getting stagnant. So what Freud,
which Dr. Weitzner, we all talk about, one of the key areas of the split comes around the issue of the inherent function of masochism as a primary drive, and Reich arguing that, and Freud gradually first introducing the idea of thanatos as a interesting theoretical frame, and then all of a sudden, unbeknownst to, at some point Reich comments that at some point all of a sudden it was like given to have the same merit as eros and fundamental biological function. And Reich and the group around Reich, it wasn't Reich alone, there was a whole group of what Freud referred to derisively as the kindergarten, but was essentially the younger, more radical therapists, including Karen Horney, Fenichel, others, just said this is not scientifically verifiable or supportable, and this led to a major split, which for Reich and a whole significant group led to a break. In some ways you could trace the actual split and break with the mainstream of psychoanalysis around that issue. So Reich at the end, as Professor Bennett is saying, is absolutely clear. He's not supporting the existence of the death instinct. He's just saying, isn't it interesting? It was actually done, I think, on the anniversary of Freud's birth. That isn't it interesting that probably he was already,
Right.
seeing that, even though he didn't get why.
Yeah.
You know.
And by the way, you just reminded me of something I wanted to add earlier, and then about Reich's leaving the psychoanalytic organizations. There's a German scholar who has done some very interesting work. His name is Nitschke, not to be confused with Schiff. And Nitschke has uncovered material, and then there's another person who's also worked on the same material, showing that Reich's being drummed out of the Psychoanalytic Association had two very different motivations. One was the discomfort that he generated because he was such an incredibly vital and energetic thinker and popular thinker. But the more profound reason was that there was an attempt to make psychoanalytic practice palpable to the Nazis. Right. That they wanted psychoanalysis to continue to exist in Germany. Remember, Hitler comes to power in '33. And so there's a concerted effort to get out of psychoanalysis any lefties. And Freud took this position that psychoanalysis is not political. What a cockamamie idea that is. But he took that position, and so you had to purge psychoanalysis. And so one thing was interesting is Erich Fromm had already come to the United States. Fromm finds out in New York that he resigned. He never resigned. He was thrown out. And in fact, they said something similar about Reich, that actually Reich resigned because he was no longer living in Germany or something like that. But in any case, it was clearly political, and it was an attempt on the part of Ernest Jones and Anna Freud to make psychoanalysis politically palpable. And they even collaborated with the Nazi head of the State Psychological Association. You can get all of this in Nitschke's articles, one of which is available online. His name is B-E-R-N-D, Bernd Nitschke. And if you're not sure, email me and I'll give you the exact spelling. But it's fascinating stuff.
And it's not a secret that Freud, till very, very late in the game, was hoping to stay in Vienna and make peace with the Nazis. And he very reluctantly went to London.
Yeah, he was protected because of the wealth of one of his patrons.
Well, the Baroness Marie Bonaparte, who basically was the one who eventually got him out. They ransomed him.
Yeah, they spent a lot of money getting him.
And she was so powerful in terms of her connections that it was doable.
And already at the time that when Freud had this very extreme reaction to the masochism paper that Reich wrote, which mentioned nothing at all about politics, and Freud said we can't publish this, because in this paper, Wilhelm Reich, says that neurosis is the product of capitalist society. He was already reacting based on this fear that that Reich's political activities and writings were going to bring down the wrath of the Nazis on the psychoanalytic.
And it gets even more complicated. It turns out that Anna Freud, who was a student that was in Reich's seminar at the time, was also telling Reich that everything was fine, don't worry. And was talking to her father about how dangerous Reich was, it turns out. We know this is documented, and about how we have to maneuver him out. She's the one who says, don't worry about anything. You'll officially resign, but we'll get you put into another part of this, and you'll stay with it. And it's all a lie. I mean, and the other thing to keep in mind is that Freud. We know that Freud. It's in Freud's journals. Was very, very concerned around this issue that the younger radical therapists like Reich, led by Reich particularly, were if their arguments against the death instinct and against the final model prevailed, that psychoanalysis was moving too much, and also not only politically to the left, but too much towards biology and towards seeing human nature as fundamentally biological in its underpinnings. Freud writes very clearly that while Frank Sulloway talks about this, that while Freud understood that was probably true, he writes specifically that we must discourage and even prevent the younger analysts from going in that direction. We must deny it because it will destroy the legacy of psychoanalysis. And after psychoanalysis is established as a legitimate institution, then we can get back to how central biology is. But until then, we must deny it and stamp it out ruthlessly. And I mean, this is in Freud's own words. It's almost, as close to a direct quote as I can give. It's in his journals and diaries and letters. And so clearly there was this confluence of circumstances that really led to an explosion. A few of the key figures like Horney and Fromm remained within the psychoanalytic movement, even though they were sort of little pushed a little bit to the
Others too, Edith Jacobson.
Yeah, right. But for Reich, I think it was already inevitable that I think he was ready to leave. There was the expression. There's not enough room in this town for the two. It was just too. It was and you have to keep in mind that up until that time, roughly around that time, Freud was on record saying very clearly that he assumed that Reich would emerge as the next major leader in the movement. And Ernst Jones, who Freud was known to have expressed a great deal of disdain for and sort of tolerated because Jones was so supportive of the work. Freud never liked Jones and found Jones to be stiff, and which he was, and probably anti-Semitic, which he was. But Jones emerged, and Jones from very, very early on did not like Reich or the younger number of the younger people around him. So I mean, some of this gets into the history and politics of it all.
But the history is interesting. Any other questions before we move? Yes, please.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
Okay. So a question for the whole panel. And I was speaking to Philip a little bit about it at lunch, but I'm really fascinated and puzzled by the automatism of the character armor and the muscular armor. In other words, the fact that, the muscular armor can be in therapy, for example, loosened up a bit, perhaps, but then it returns, even in the absence of any trauma. And I don't know if I have a really clearly formulated question, but I wonder if anybody can
I was
speak to that.
curious at the word automatism. You mean what the
Well, for
strength?
example,
the rigidity of it?
yes, exactly, like the habitual disappearance.
Persistence.
Persistence.
Yeah. So habitual character attitudes return, habitual behavioral.
I think, from my understanding, Reich was equally perplexed by this, as were they all.
That was your question, really. That's what I understood. Yeah.
Well, he gave a little bit of insight into that in the bioelectrical experiments, which is one of the most amazing things to me in that book with the sugar salt experiments, showing this points out the fact that it's a living energy. That there's a vital thing to it. He was doing the sugar salt experiments. You give a person sugar, you get a pleasure reaction. Give them sugar, you get a pleasure reaction. Then tell them you're going to give them sugar, give them salt. And you get the drop in the energy. Then he gives them sugar, and it drops lower. So showing the bioenergetic nature of the refractory nature of trying to recover the pulsation. So then you can understand a little more with the armoring that it's just. You can't think of it mechanically.
Right, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think what it is the best statement on it. I think from Reich that I always read was he's in numerous discussions and in later interviews, he was saying that we're dealing with dynamite. We're dealing with forces that are not simply theoretical. They're living. They're alive. You're dealing with living, forces that are powerful. I mean, we're not dealing with simply like when we talk about emotional release. It's really emotional release is the expressive nature of it, but it's profoundly deep on a cellular level. It's not in your muscles. It's in the cellular. It's in the basic cellular structure.
Well, let me remind those of you who know Freud, and maybe those of you who don't know something new, that Freud had a synonym for the death instinct, which was the repetition.
Repetition compulsion.
Right. The compulsion in a masochistic, inexplicable way to repeat unpleasurable, painful, traumatic experiences, even though you would think from the sex economy or from the psychic economy point of view, there's no reason for the mind or the organism to want to repeat such a thing. So that's why these ancillary concepts like death instinct and in my opinion, perhaps deadly orgone, are invoked as some kind of an ultimate explanation. But the reality is that we have these death-like schemas inside us. Your patient, Dr. Schiff, obviously has a schema inside her somewhere that if she moves towards the world in a healthy way, she's going to get punished. Freud would say, aha, this is an unconscious guilt that's going to be very, very difficult to work with. You're going to see the repetition compulsion mirroring its head. You're going to see resistance. You're going to see negative therapeutic reactions where you think she should be getting better and she's going to be getting worse. And nobody can answer this basic question. Why is it that these death-like, rigid, reactionary, painful structures continue in us?
Well, I can answer.
Oh.
Time is up.
The Nobel Committee on the phone. We're about to hear something.
Wait a minute, that's kind of important.
Go ahead.
Okay.
We want to hear it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you took me serious. Well, one of the things to say about it is to realize that how well for us, for organisms to survive, is that we've got to learn things very efficient. And we've got to be able to repeat things very efficient. And two, that these are psychomotor responses. I mean, if you haven't ridden on a bike for a long time, you get on the bike, you can remember how to ride your bike. How is that possible? Because these kind of schemes, these kind of what you maybe call procedural schemes, okay, live in our nervous systems and even a priori before our nervous systems in a very basic way. And therefore, they become very hard to unlearn. And seeing that so many of these early schemes are so tied to emotion and affect, which is the way the infant and primary caretaker respond, you have these built-in schemas that have repetition again and again and again and again and again ad absurdum, and so they're very difficult. So we can say then possibly that my client has unconscious guilt, and she does have unconscious guilt, and there's all this.
But you're optimistic that with the proper working through and
yes,
and exploring and digging,
right, and that's the reason why these things keep going around. You have to do it again and again and again. But why the person has to do it again and again and again in their life?
Yeah, I mean, Wright's paper on masochism, Wright's chapter in Paradox of Masochism is a model of how you challenge an idea like the death instinct and show that in fact there's something clinically going on that we can understand. That the patient is like a bursting bladder, and that there's the fear of bursting, and then later on the fear of falling, orgasm anxiety. All these concepts were productive concepts to show that you didn't have to invoke a death instinct. So the challenge for the contemporary orgone therapist and physicist is to write a paper against Wright's deadly orgone to show why you don't need to invoke the concept of a deadly orgone, which is a finalistic concept, to explain why the armoring is so.
I mean, we need to finish because we need to be out of here by 5. Actually, it's 5. I want to thank everybody and say that we're planning something hasn't been settled yet for the spring, so we'll keep you posted. Dr. Weitzner and I have been talking about the possibility of doing a symposium in which we bring together a group of psychoanalysts and orgonomists to discuss more of these issues.
Say that again?
So we might do that. But I want to thank Philip Bennett, Daniel Schiff, Eric Weitzner, and all of you for coming. And stay in touch. And there is also an ongoing reading seminar that we're involved with. Right now it's a listening seminar. We're listening to tapes of Wright. But you're free to take these before you leave. If you would close your chair and put it against the wall when you get up with help. Thank you.
Thank you.